Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. Before we dive into today's episode, this is just your reminder to go and like, subscribe, comment, leave a review, share the podcast with a friend, do all of the things on whatever podcast platform you are currently listening to the podcast on. It really helps for other people to be able to find the podcast and benefit from it as well. All right. Today, we are going to be diving into helping dancers advocate for themselves in the studio. And this is a topic or a request that was sent in by a listener who requested for me to cover this. And this, I will just say, was a dance parent. And they wanted kind of advice or information about how they can help their dancer to advocate for themselves in the studio. And at first, I was really excited about this podcast topic request. But the more I thought about it, it didn't sit super well with me because in some ways, this is putting all of the onus on the dancer. And in reality, it shouldn't be up to the dancer to be having to advocate for themselves. And I'm going to dive into that a little bit more and sort of like where my thought process is with regards to this. But we will talk about advocating for dancers in the studio. This is a conversation that's been coming up a lot in the last few weeks in the clinic as we transition to a new dance season where dancers I've had this conversation with some dancers who are joining a new dance environment, like a new dance studio or a new dance company. And, we've talked through some of their worry or anxiety about how they're going to be able to communicate with their new teachers or artistic directors or things like that. This has come up with regards to dancers who are still rehabbing from an injury and then going into a new dance season and feeling like they want to put their best foot forward, but they know that they're not back at 100% and not dancing at 100% yet. But then this kind of idea of like, well, am I going to be judged? Am I going to be... are the teachers going to be upset with me if I'm not dancing 100%? It's the beginning of a season. It's not a good time to be injured. All of these thoughts and feelings that go along with this. So we've been having a lot of conversations about how you can advocate for yourself within the dance studio. But the reason that this doesn't sit super well with me is that I feel like in some regards, it is almost like taking the wrong approach. Like I said, this approach puts all of the onus on the dancer to be the one who is doing the advocating, when in reality, these types of conversations or the structures that support our dancers should really be coming from the top. Are people in positions of leadership, and whether that is, the director or the studio owner or the teacher in the front of the classroom, or even us as healthcare professionals coming from a position of authority and of leadership, it really should be us who is creating the environment that is supporting these dancers. It should not be up to the most vulnerable people in the room. So this is the dancers. And whether that is in a professional company setting and the dancers are vulnerable because, let's face it, they're probably the lowest paid people in the room. And they're the most vulnerable to decisions that are being made by other people in power positions. So whether that's decisions based on whether their contract's going to be renewed the next season or casting for roles in upcoming pieces or things like that. So these power dynamics exist in the professional world, and they certainly exist maybe even more profoundly in the studio dance world because we have children that we're dealing with. And even our older dancers who might be 17, 18, they may be mature and they may be presenting themselves as young adults and things like that. But really, at the end of the day, they're still minors. They're still in a really vulnerable position partly due to their age. And then also just, again, this like power dynamic where they want to impress their teacher. They want to please their teacher. The teacher has control over, again, things like casting, things like whether they get chosen to do a solo the next year, all of these different things that are really big in a dancer's world make them vulnerable to these power differentials or power dynamics that are happening. And so putting the onus on the dancer to be the one advocating for themselves is not necessarily fair. We want to create environments, or we should want to create environments and create training facilities and practices that are going to center the dancer and really put their health and wellness at the forefront. And whether that's their physical health or whether that is just considering things like how they're supported with supplementary training programs and things like that, and whether it's their mental health, all of those things should be at the forefront of how these programs or companies are operating. And ideally, we want to see that coming from the top down. So it is not our most vulnerable people having to be the ones who are having to stand up for themselves. And when we sort of put that on the dancers, and this is honestly what we see in the dance world. It's very rare that we see environments where the leadership is taking on those roles. And I did a podcast a couple of episodes ago about the change that the Royal Ballet School is implementing in terms of their full-time vocational training program. If you haven't listened to that, you can go back and listen to it. But that was an example of leadership saying, okay, it's up to us to change the structure, change the environment in order to promote health and wellness, or in order to actually be embodying what we know is best practice within the research. But that is an outlier in the dance world or in the dance community. That is not the norm yet. I hope that that becomes the norm more and more and more. But right now, that is not the norm. And so there's been a really big improvement in the amount of knowledge that we have around dancer health and wellness and dance medicine and dance science. There's tons more research happening than there ever was before. There's a lot more knowledge dissemination happening than there ever was before. Dancers themselves are far more knowledgeable in terms of training practices, like what best practice is, injury prevention things like the importance of strength training and cross training and periodization and all of the things that we talk about on this podcast. Individual dancers are more knowledgeable and maybe empowered in that sense than they have ever been in any other previous generation. But we have yet to see a lot of systemic change in the environments that these dancers are in. And so right now, the onus is still primarily on the dancer to be the one implementing or incorporating these things. And so, this holds true in all areas of dancer health and wellness. So this could be, the importance of strength training. Dancers are aware of that. A lot of dancers are seeking out strength training and are doing supplementary strength training. But the number of dancers who actually have it incorporated into their program, where somebody's overseeing it, somebody's doing the programming for them, it is in their weekly schedule, they don't have to find the time outside to do it, that's not happening super commonly. Like that, again, is not the norm. The norm is the dancers who are aware of it and see it as a priority are then having to fit that in outside of their training schedule. So maybe they're waking up early and going to the gym, or they are paying for a personal trainer outside of their main training programs and doing that on their own time. And so this is what we're seeing in the dance world is, yes, we're seeing progress and improvements in dancer health and wellness, but the onus still is primarily on the dancer to be the one to kind of incorporate or implement, that is maybe the right word. And so that is sort of a similar lens that I'm coming at this advocacy piece from, because again, we are asking the dancer who's already trying to juggle, potentially injury rehabilitation and, their nutrition and their rest and recovery and their strength training program and all of these other things, they're already having to do all of that. And then we're asking them to also advocate for themselves in the studio to say, I need modifications in class, or I need to take extra breaks between exercises, or, I don't feel that this stretch that we're doing in class is safe. I'm feeling pain when I'm in this position. Whatever it is that dancers are having to speak up about, we are again putting them in a vulnerable position to be forcing them to be the ones to do that. So although I loved the suggestion of helping dancers advocate for themselves, because I do think it is a skill that many dancers, most dancers will benefit from, I think we're looking at the problem a little bit from the wrong angle. And so when I think about advocacy, I think that dancers need other people who will be advocating on their behalf. And this might be a parent. If you are a dance parent and you have a dancer, you might need to be involved in advocating on their behalf to communicate with the teachers or whoever it is about what's going on and whether this has to do with an injury or whether this has to do with mental health or whatever it is. So it might be a parent who is helping advocate. It might be a healthcare practitioner. I view this as one of the really important parts of my role as a physiotherapist. And so I am happy to communicate directly with a dance studio or with a dance teacher or whoever it is that I need to be communicating with in order to advocate on behalf of this dancer, so that it is not entirely up to them to be the one to say, hey, I can't dance full out, or I can't actually dance in this weekend's performance or compete in this competition because of this injury. We should not be relying on dancers to have to be communicating that information. So advocacy might be a parent. It might be a healthcare practitioner, and it might also be a dance teacher. If you are a dance teacher, that might also be your role. And maybe you're helping that dancer advocate to other teachers within the studio. This is a question I get asked a lot in the clinic, or it comes up a lot, or a situation where there's maybe one teacher or a handful of teachers at a studio who are potentially practicing things that feel unsafe to the dancer, or teachers who maybe dismiss some of the dancers' modifications that have been, or restrictions that have been put in place as part of their rehab plan. And so they might have teachers at the studio who are totally understanding and accommodating. And then they may have a teacher who maybe doesn't understand what's going on or has a different view on how things are operating or things like that. And so teachers can also be the one advocating for that dancer. And so a teacher might be communicating directly with another teacher or with a studio owner or with a competition director or whoever it is, so that everyone is on the same page and the dancer is actually being taken care of, and they're not left with this kind of role as trying to be the middleman and trying to appease people when they're already in a vulnerable position. And when I'm talking about advocacy, it's not just from a perspective of, like injury recovery. That's certainly what we're dealing with most in the clinic, because I'm usually working with dancers who are rehabbing from injuries. And so we're implementing modifications to their class training. And so it is then them having to say, okay, I'm not allowed to jump yet, or I can't do turns on that leg, or whatever their modifications are. So that's certainly what I'm dealing with the most, but it can be other things as well. It can be a dancer saying, this stretch is hurting me. Like, I feel pain when I'm doing this. Can we, come up with another stretch? Can we modify the position or things like that? So it can be stuff like that. It could be things around having enough time to have snack breaks between classes so they can actually fuel themselves. Like, it can come up in all sorts of different ways. So I'm not just talking about modifying in class because of injuries, but that is certainly what comes up the most for me, or when I am having to advocate for a dancer, that is often the thing that is coming up the most. So, like I said, I will touch on sort of tips for helping dancers advocate for themselves in the studio, but really these tips are actually more so for their support network, the other people who are helping them advocate. And certainly, like I said, I don't want to sort of be dismissive of the dancer, because I do think it is like powerful life lesson for dancers to learn how to speak up for themselves and how to advocate for themselves. I just think in the dance industry, we have relied on that for far too long, and it is time that we shift shift that thinking and create environments that actually support the dancers so that it is not such a barrier for them to have to stand up for themselves or have to advocate for themselves. But in terms of actual practical tips for advocating, whether you are a parent or whether you are a healthcare practitioner or whether you are another dance teacher or a studio owner or whoever you are who is supporting these dancers, I think the number one thing is open communication. So we want to come at these situations with an open mind, first of all. I know it doesn't serve anyone to come at a situation and already have sort of like preconceived notions about what somebody else's intentions are or how they're treating a dancer or things like that. So we want to have really open communication, and that can be verbal communication. Maybe we're lucky enough that we can have a face-to-face conversation with the person that we are needing to talk to, whether, again, it might be a teacher, it might be a director, it might be whoever it is. But it can also look like written communication. And so having, email communication or whatever that looks like so that it's kind of written down. But open communication is key. We want to also have some amount of information sharing. And so we can't necessarily have open and honest communication if it's not sort of a two-way information sharing pathway. So we want everyone to be on the same page. Where I see communication break down a lot is that, I will talk to a dancer about something in the clinic or even a parent sometimes, and then that information kind of gets passed to like one teacher, and then maybe that teacher passes the information to another teacher. And oftentimes it's like, the game that you played as a kid, broken telephone, where as the message gets passed on, it gets kind of a little bit convoluted. And so then by the time it sort of comes back around, you're like, that's not what I said at all, or that wasn't the original message, or whatever it is. So we want to make sure that we have some sort of way of sharing information. And that's going to look different in different situations. If you are in a company setting, you probably have some sort of formal communication lines or, there's like software and stuff out there for that as well. So it might be like a more formal process. If it's more of just like a community dance studio setting, that might just be getting permission from the dancer to email the people involved and sort of lay out the plan and say, this is what is happening. And so again, everybody's on the same page and we have this open communication and information sharing. The information sharing, it's really important. It's a two-way street. We want to be really receptive and encouraging of the studios to also be sharing information with us, because we can be getting information directly from the dancer, but the teachers might say, in class, I'm seeing X, Y, Z, and where this comes up a lot. And I'm not pointing fingers at any particular dancer, but dancers will say, oh yeah, no, things are going really well. Like I'm not having any trouble in class. I don't really have any pain. Like I'm good. They kind of are like, come in and everything's all like sunshiny and roses. And the teachers will be like, yeah, no, she can't make it through half of class. Then she's sitting down and she's having to like ice her knee. And I'm really worried about, and so we do get different information from different people sometimes. So we want to make sure that everybody is on the same page. We also, I think education is a key part of this advocacy as well. And so certainly, and maybe this is a bigger piece of it because I'm a healthcare professional, but when I am communicating with whether it's the dancer or the parent or the teacher or whoever it is, we're really trying to educate on the why. So why is it that we are implementing potentially like modifications or restrictions on what the dancer can do in class? It's not just because I'm like, oh, they just need to rest for 2 weeks necessarily. If I can educate the teacher and say, this is what's happening, this is the modification we're going to make, and this is why, and then this is the plan for progression through that. Once they meet this milestone, then we're going to progress to this. Once they meet this milestone, they're going to progress to this, so that everybody can see the why behind it. They can see that it is a well thought out, intentional process, as opposed to just something that somebody's coming in and saying, oh, they shouldn't be doing this or that type of thing. So I think education is a huge piece of this. And this, again, can go both ways. So this could be the teacher saying, okay, I'm going to share with you or educate you on why I've made this casting decision based on these things that I see going on. And so that people are all on the same page. And then I think the last thing in terms of advocacy is making sure that we all have shared goals. And so these should ideally be dancer-centered goals. And so sometimes when I'm working with dancers, I'll have dancers who have a goal that is maybe not the next thing that's happening. And so they might have, I'm trying to think of a good example, maybe they have a show that's coming up, but then they have an exam that's happening like a few weeks after that. And their main goal is to make it through the exam really successfully. They've been working on it for like a year and they really don't want to miss their exam. And so they may choose to not participate in something that's happening before that. And sometimes, again, teachers might sort of get their back up a little bit and say, but we have this show that's happening and I really need them in the show and, X, Y, Z, whatever. But if we have shared goals for this dancer and everybody understands what those goals are. And in this hypothetical situation, it might be, okay, if the dancer participates in this show, they're at risk of exacerbating their injury and they're going to need a longer recovery time after, and then they're not going to be prepared and ready for their exam. If everybody's on the same page, everybody can see that that is what the outcome of that will be, and they know that that dancer's goal is actually the exam, then we can facilitate that. And maybe it's that they miss the show. Maybe they have an altered role in the show, modified parts, whatever it ends up looking like. But making sure that the goals are shared and understood among all of the different stakeholders, but primarily among that dancer, the dancer being centered as the primary person for that goal. I also find, sometimes, this is a little bit of an aside, but when I'm communicating with dance teachers or studio owners or people within the studio setting, or even with dancers themselves, sometimes when we think about goals as a healthcare provider, we're often thinking about like injury prevention and, recovery from an injury and all these things that are really like anatomically based. But the dancer themselves and the dance kind of faculty, they actually might have different performance goals. And so they might be more concerned about the dancer being able to perform at a certain level. And so we just need to be aware of that when we're thinking about goals, that not all goals are exactly the same. And I know for myself, I have to check myself sometimes, because what I'm thinking of as a goal in terms of, their physical performance or like injury prevention or those types of things is maybe not the same goal that the dancer has. They might have a goal that's much more aligned with performance optimization or performance enhancement. So I just wanted to throw that in there because it's something that we do talk about sometimes in terms of, them not always being the exact same thing. And again, it's important to center the dancers and make sure we're thinking about their goals. So I realize that this is not kind of a typical podcast episode, and it maybe sounds a bit more like a rant than anything else, but I did really want to address it because, again, like I said, I did have a request for this topic, and I do think it is a great topic to cover, but I hope that maybe this podcast episode has given you a bit more food for thought in terms of how it is that we go about advocating for dancers or requiring dancers to advocate for themselves, and having them be a little bit more supported in this process. Because like I said, I do think it's a good skill for people to learn how to, stand up for themselves and articulate their needs and all of that. But I don't think the onus should always fall 100% to the dancers. Again, they're already the people who are most vulnerable within these dance structures. And so to then expect them to be the people who are standing up for themselves is really probably not fair. And so we need to really look at the structures of our organizations and how we're operating and the environments that we're operating in, and hopefully change those from the ground up to have structures that support these dancers so that they don't have to be doing as much advocacy for themselves. So, like I said, not my typical podcast episode. Thank you for sticking around and listening till the end. Hopefully it gave you a little bit of food for thought about this topic. I would love to hear your thoughts on it. If you have any experience with trying to advocate for yourself as a dancer, or maybe you are a parent or a healthcare professional and you have tried to help advocate on behalf of a dancer, please reach out. Let me know. I would love to hear your experiences. You can reach me at Dance Physio Erika with a K on social media, or my email is also in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. You definitely want to stay tuned for next week's podcast episode because it is our 100th podcast episode and it is going to be a fun one. I have some surprises in store for you. So mark your calendars for next week. Podcast drops on Tuesday. You don't want to miss that one. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.